Hello. Hi, what's up? It's 12:10. And you can see my water bottle. Hey everyone. This music is very chill. Is it too loud? Let me know. Usually not awake for these streams, but I could really hear your voice. But I don't usually do my read stream at this time. It's just that I missed my opportunity to do it this afternoon, and then other people were streaming when I was going to do it, and so I was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna try to do it tonight. So I made it into a late night read stream, inspired by people like Terry, who do late night read streams. But hi, Salad. Hi, Riddy. Hi, husband. Thank you for shouting out, Salad. I should say I'm usually not awake at this time for streams. Oh, okay. So, was anyone able to go back and see what happened in the book last time? Because I don't know why I'm having nose issues. I just blew my nose. But it feels weird. Because I have no idea what's happening in the book. It's been a while. I probably should have went ahead and looked. I mean, I guess we could now. Theoretically. Here. Let's do it. Let's pause the music for a second. Reading streams. Okay, let's see here. Thanks. The girl detective wished wildly that she were invisible. Can you hear that? What harm the man might inflict if he saw her. He has such a violent temper, Nancy realized. But Aborn's glance did not stray to the dress section. I guess he didn't want to dress. Instead, he reached up for two large suitcases which were on a shelf above the closed door. As she reached down to grasp the ring in it, her body became tense. This time there was no mistake. She had heard a peculiar sound, which seemed to come from beneath the floor. It sounded like a groan, Nancy decided. She felt cold all over. Someone was imprisoned in the cellar. Who and why? As Nancy tugged at the ring, another idea came to her. This might be a trap laid for her. It's a trap! Oh, what should I do? She thought, hesitating. There was still time to run away from danger. But the fear that some person was in distress gave her the courage to open the trapdoor. As it swung upward, Nancy saw before her a flight of stone steps leading down into complete darkness. A gust of damp, musty air struck her in the face and momentarily repulsed her. Air struck her in the face. She had her flashlight. The battery could not last much longer. Already the light was so weak that she could... You know what? I could just, like, look at the book. It won't take long, she thought. I remember these late night streams you speak of. Yes, they inspire me, Terry. Nancy peered anxiously into the black abyss below. To her horror, she saw a man stretched out full length on a bench. His face was turned upward, and Nancy caught a full glimpse of the countenance. He was Jacob Aborn. Oh, that's literally where it ends. Okay. That was chapter 12. It's weird seeing me in YouTube over here and then seeing me in OBS right now. It's weird. Okay. I don't know. Let me know how the music volume is if you want it higher or lower. Just let me know. I really don't know what's going on. I don't know. The last chapter was called A Black Abyss. Nancy was hiding in a closet. So I guess the Aborns are the couple that is taking care of Laura or whatever her name is. Okay, Salad. And obviously they're doing it to get her inheritance. I think that's the basic gist of things, which is very much like Clock. The plot of Clock. So, I guess, we can go ahead and start things here. The chapter we're on is 13, and it's called An Actor's Ruse. Oh, thank you for shouting out, Terry. You can go ahead and shout out yourself, Riddy, if you really want to. I guess I'll figure out what's going on when we get back into it, because that's kind of the best way to jog my memory. Thank you, Terry. Yep, just in case. Dang it. Okay, so let's get started. I don't know how long I'm going to be reading tonight because I do need to do some cleaning before I go to bed. So let's just let's get this started and see how it goes. See where we end up in the story, because I really have no clue. No idea, no clue. Go to bed at 5? Yeah, who knows, Terry? Who knows? I don't think I have ballet class tomorrow, so I'm not worried about what time I go to bed tonight. But I do need to clean, okay? Alright. An Actor's Ruse. Spellbound, Nancy stood like a stone image, gazing down into the face of Jacob Aborn. How had the man reached the bungalow ahead of her? What was he doing sleeping in the musty cellar of the old shack? As these thoughts flashed through Nancy's mind, the beam of her flashlight flickered again. Then it went out, leaving her in total darkness. Sheer panic took possession of the girl detective. Something very strange was going on. She must not be caught in a trap. Turning, she gave a low cry and stumbled up the stairway and toward the window through which she had entered. Her flight was abruptly checked as she banged one foot on something metallic that moved ahead of her. In a second, she smelled kerosene. A lantern, she decided. The thought of a light gave her hope. She felt around and discovered an old-time oil lantern. Collecting her wits, she stopped and listened for any sounds of pursuit. There were none. The shack appeared as deserted and silent as before. I'm sure that was Jacob Aborn down in the cellar, Nancy thought in perplexity. I didn't imagine it. But how did he get here so fast? After I left his house, I didn't waste much time. Suddenly, an amazing thought came to Nancy. Was the man she had seen by chance a brother, even a twin of Jacob Aborn? He might be honest, and Jacob had found him in the way. I'm going to find out, Nancy declared excitedly. Eagerly, she reached into the pocket of her dress, recalling that at dinner she had taken a pack of matches from the hotel dining table for her souvenir collection. Good, the pack was still there. Striking a match, she was pleased to discover that the lantern was half full of oil. Someone had used it recently, for the glass was clean. Nancy lighted the wick, and a flame spurted up. Carrying the lantern, she returned to the trapdoor. Suddenly, from below, Nancy heard a moan of pain. This was followed by a pitiful cry of help. That settles it, the worried girl thought. As she descended the steps, the lantern's flickering glow revealed that the cellar was dungeon-like, with solid stone walls and no windows. And we have a picture here. It says, caption is, "From below came a pitiful cry of help." Hey, Alex. Welcome in. Okay. She held the light high above the figure on the bench. A man, deathly pale, was lying where she had first seen him, but he was not Laura's guardian. There's certainly a startling resemblance, though, Nancy thought, her heart filled with pity for this unfortunate stranger. Dropping to her knees, she felt his pulse. It was faint but regular. He's just unconscious, she told herself in relief. At the same time, Nancy saw with horror a large chain around the man's waist. It was attached to the prisoner in such a way that it allowed him some freedom of motion and yet held him captive. Was Jacob Aborn responsible for this atrocity? Nancy wondered angrily. I must do something to revive this man, she decided, and get him away from here. Picking up the lantern, Nancy mounted the cellar steps 2 at a time. She headed for a small sink in one corner of the room above, where she had seen a pump. After a search through the cupboard, she at last found a battered tin cup. Quickly pumping water into it, she returned to the cellar. Nancy wet her handkerchief and applied it gently to the prisoner's forehead. Then she sprinkled a little of the water on his face and chafed his wrist. The man stirred slightly and moaned. As she gazed anxiously into his face, Nancy wondered how she could have mistaken him for Jacob Aborn. Although the 2 men were of the same age and had similar facial characteristics, the prisoner was gaunt and thin. His features, contrary to Mr. Aborn's, were gentle and relaxed. Now Nancy saw that the man was slowly regaining consciousness. As his eyes fluttered open, he cried, "Help!" feebly, then stared into Nancy's face, amazed. "Help has come," Nancy said quietly. It's kind of creepy. The man attempted to raise himself to a sitting position with Nancy's aid. "Didn't think help would ever come," he murmured. Then he saw the cup in Nancy's hand and asked for water. Nancy steadied the cup while he drank. Finally, the man leaned against the wall. "First water I've had in 24 hours, he said more clearly. The young sleuth was horrified. She introduced herself, then asked, "Who are you, and who did this terrible thing to you?" A bitter expression passed over the prisoner's face. "I'm Jacob Aborn," he said. "A crook by the name of Stumpy Dowd took over my house, imprisoned me here, and somehow or other arranged for my new ward, Laura Pendleton, to come to my home earlier than she was expected. Yesterday he told me that he had the girl's inheritance in his possession, and showed bonds to prove it." "You're Jacob Aborn," Nancy repeated, as the prisoner, exhausted by these words, leaned against the wall. Quickly, Nancy's mind flashed back to everything that had happened since she had met Laura. The puzzling questions that had bothered her about the girl's guardian now became clear. Most of all, it was a relief to know that the person to whom Marie Pendleton had entrusted her daughter's care was not a criminal. Equally important, Nancy realized that Stephen Dowd, alias Stumpy, used his talent as an actor and skill with makeup to fool other people, and then probably swindled them. The young sleuth wondered if there was a tie-in between Laura's inheritance and the Monroe National Bank thefts of stocks and bonds. She must find out from Jacob Aborn, but the police should be notified immediately, as well as her father. Aloud, Nancy said, "I want to hear the whole story of what has happened to you, Mr. Aborn, but first..." Briefly, she told of having met the man who had impersonated him, and of seeing Laura at Twin Lakes. Nancy was about to add that Laura was now at her home, when Mr. Aborn said, "If Stumpy caught you here once today, we'd better get out right now." He told Nancy that Dad kept the key to the padlock on his chains on a hook near the stairway. "This is a lucky break," said Nancy. She snatched the lantern from the floor and started toward the stairs. "Please hurry," Mr. Aborn said faintly. "Stumpy Dowd is a dangerous criminal. He boasted to me that he and his accomplices have victimized several people besides Laura." Nancy anxiously moved the lantern up and down, illuminating the dingy walls. Just above her head to the left, she finally saw the hook with a key dangling from it. "I have it!" she exclaimed triumphantly. As Nancy hurried back to Mr. Aborn's side, she speculated on how the Dowds had found out about Mr. Aborn, his wife, and Laura. I'll have you free in a minute, Mr. Aborn," Nancy said as she stooped over the bench. While she worked on the rusty lock, Nancy asked if he had known the Dowds previously. "Yes," he replied. "Mrs. Dowd was hired by my wife as a maid to come when we arrived. Soon after I reached the house, her husband came. He grew quite loud and abusive, and when I objected, he knocked me unconscious. When I came to, I was chained in the cellar." "How dreadful!" Nancy exclaimed. "But where is your wife?" she asked. "She had to go to Florida unexpectedly. Her mother, who lives there, had an emergency operation. Marion went down to be with her, and I moved into our new home." Mr. Aborn sighed. "Of course I haven't heard a word from her since I've been tied up here." You'll be able to find out about her now, Nancy assured him. Do you know how many people are working with Stumpy Dad? One or two others besides his wife, I believe. Stumpy Dad is secretive about some things, although he boasted a lot. I did hear him mention the name Fred, but I don't know who he is. When the padlock finally snapped open, Nancy's spirits soared. Now the suitcase of securities that Stumpy Dad had packed could be retrieved. The criminals could be apprehended, and her father's case perhaps solved. Meanwhile, neither Nancy nor Mr. Aborn had noticed a dark figure creeping slowly down the steps. Nearer and nearer the man came, a stout cane gripped tightly in his right hand. That's wonderful, Nancy, Mr. Aborn exclaimed. Now if I just knew where Laura is. As he spoke, Mr. Aborn glanced up. A look of horror froze his face. Look out, Nancy, he shouted. Okay. Chapter 14 is next, A Desperate Situation. This is really relaxing for the tension in the book. Cleaning hype, reading and cleaning hype. Dress pockets are the best. Alex. Thank you for shouting out, Alex. Hope you're enjoying that listening. I was doing the same thing, muchly. And now I'm in Z-Dark. Z-Dark? It dark? It dark in the book or it dark in your house? I look weird. Dark in my home. Okay. Okay. Yeah, why is it dark? Did you decide to turn... I don't know what's up with my nose. It just feels weird. Did you decide to turn the lights off? Or are you in a storm? Or what's happening? It's supposed to rain tonight. I think pretty soon. Oh, Keegan, if you're still here, it's supposed to rain all day tomorrow. Okay. Without further ado, A Desperate Situation. The warning came too late. Before Nancy could turn, the end of the cane crashed down on her head. With a low moan of pain, she sagged to the floor and lay still. How long she remained unconscious, the young sleuth did not know. When at last she opened her eyes, Nancy found herself stretched out on the cold floor of the cellar. Bewildered, it was a full minute before she could account for the splitting pain in her head. Then, with a shudder, the young sleuth remembered what had happened. She had been struck down from behind. Who was her assailant? Nancy became aware that someone was standing over her, but objects whirled before her eyes, and she could not distinguish the face. Then, gradually, her vision cleared. She saw Stumpy Dad gazing down upon her, a satisfied leer on his face. Well, Miss Drew, he said mockingly, we meet again. You've gotten in my way once too often. As Nancy started to speak, Dowd reached down. Catching Nancy by an arm, he jerked her roughly to her feet. Nancy was so weak that she nearly fell over. Nevertheless, with a show of spirit, she said, You'll regret this, I promise you. Let the girl go, Jacob Aborn pleaded from the other side of the room. Do anything you like to me, but set her free. Nancy saw that he was again padlocked. Stumpy Dowd glared at his other prisoner. It's quite impossible for me to release either of you, he said calmly. You see, you both know too much. Nancy was aware that resistance would be useless. Right now, she did not have the strength to make a break for the stairs. But as the criminal began to unwind a long rope, Nancy realized that unless she thought of something, the situation would be desperate. There would be no way to escape. As Stumpy began to bind Nancy's feet together, he said sarcastically, Mr. Aborn will enjoy having company, and you two have so much to talk about. This happy music in the background. An idea suddenly came to Nancy. She remembered that a detective who had called on her father a few months before had told her how it was possible to hold one's hands while being bound so as to slip the bonds later. He had given a demonstration. How convenient. If I can only remember the correct position, Nancy prayed fervently. When Dad began to bind Nancy's wrists, she tried to follow the detective's instructions. As the ropes cut into her flesh, it seemed to Nancy that she must have made a mistake. Certainly there was little space between her wrists and the bonds. I don't know if I can do this music right now. It's too happy for what's going on. Let me see if I can get something else. Why is that? That seems louder. Hope you have a great day, right, meow? I don't want chill, though. I want a different station. What's epic? Okay, this might be better. Rather than the happy music that was happening. We'll see, we'll try it out. Let me know if it's too loud. Okay, and now, just to make sure you won't get away, Stumpy muttered with a sneer. He took the end of the rope and ran it through a ring in the wall, knotting the rope fast. I guess that will hold you for a while, and teach you not to meddle in affairs that are none of your business, the man added. Nancy Drew had never been so angry in her life, but she realized that any argument she might give would only provoke the man to further torture. So she set her jaw grimly and kept still. "You'll pay for this, Dowd," Jacob Aborn spoke up in a quavering voice. This is a little much. Skip. When you get free, Stumpy Dowd taunted. That's a laugh. Why, you fool! How do you propose to get help? If it hadn't been for this meddlesome Drew girl, only the rats would have known you were here. Nancy could not help but remark quietly, "The police will catch you in the end." "I doubt it," Dad said with confidence. "I've covered my trail thoroughly. I've made plans to leave the country, and I'd like to see the police or anyone else catch me." He turned to Laura's guardian. "First, of course, we'll have to get the jewels away from Laura." "How do you propose to do that?" Nancy asked quickly, "when you don't know where she is?" Stumpy Dowd laughed. "That's what you think. Laura's at your home in River Heights, Nancy Drew." As Nancy blinked, a look of horror came into Mr. Aborn's eyes. Nancy knew he was wondering why she had not mentioned Laura's being at her home. Also, he realized that his last hope of keeping Laura's whereabouts unknown was gone. Nancy, too, was worried. What did Stumpy plan to do? Right now, he looked pleased at his prisoner's reactions. "My wife overheard Laura placing a call to Nancy Drew in River Heights yesterday morning. When Laura ran away, we had a hunch she would go there. I asked my detective to find out." Dad said the sleuth had seen Laura leaving the house that afternoon with a young man. "I presume she left her jewels behind," he added, "but we'll get them before we leave this area." "Don't try anything foolish," Nancy warned. "All my plans are well made," Dad said coolly. "Too bad you aren't more cautious, Miss Drew." He said that his wife had felt a draft in the house and gone downstairs to find the front door partway open. Then she had seen a girl heading into the woods and had awakened him. Dowd had figured out that it might be Nancy. "That's the end of my story," he said, "except to tell you, Aborn, I sold your blue sedan this morning. The money helped pay for my new foreign car." Jacob Aborn was so furious he almost choked. "You robber! You kidnapper!" he cried out. "Tut tut, none of that," Dowd said. "You'll get your blood pressure up." "Laura's not in your clutches, and she won't get there," Aborn stormed. "And I can support her without any inheritance." Dowd shrugged. "It won't do any good to threaten me. You're my prisoner, and don't forget it. After the jewels are mine." Nancy felt as if she would choke with rage. Mr. Aborn closed his eyes and seemed to have fainted. Meanwhile, Stumpy Dad had replaced the key on the wall. The hook supporting it, Nancy saw, was far out of the two prisoners' reach. "You can think of this in the days ahead," the crook taunted. "And now, goodbye." Turning, he ambled up the steps. Nancy heard mocking laughter as the trapdoor was slammed shut. Soon a death-like quiet fell on the shack. "Mr. Aborn," Nancy called. There was no answer. Nancy's heart beat wildly. Was the man only in a faint, or had something worse happened to him? Holding her breath, she strained her ears to see if she could detect any sign of life. A few seconds later, Nancy caught faint sounds of inhaling and exhaling. Thank goodness, she thought. Presently, the man stirred, and regaining consciousness, looked about. Seeing Nancy, he exclaimed, "Now I remember. We were so near freedom." "Yes, we were, Mr. Aborn, and we may get out of here yet. I'm trying to slip this rope off my wrists. In the meantime, I want to tell you why I didn't mention that Laura is at my home. I was about to do so when you urged that we leave the shack as fast as possible." "I see, and I forgive you," said Mr. Aborn. Never having met you, Dowd's announcement gave me a momentary feeling of distrust in you, but that's gone now." "I don't like these." "Okay. Then would you mind telling me about Laura's mother and the estate she left?" Nancy requested as she worked to free her hands. "I'll be glad to. Mrs. Pendleton appointed the Monroe National Bank executor of her estate, and me as Laura's guardian. During Mrs. Pendleton's long illness, she had all her securities taken from her private safe deposit box and put in care of the bank. They were turned over to the custodian department and kept in the bank's personal vault." "Then how could Stumpy Dowd get them?" Nancy asked. "That's the mystery. He didn't say." Nancy was convinced now that a good portion of Laura's inheritance must be among the securities stolen from the bank. She asked whether Mrs. Pendleton had left a large estate. Mr. Aborn nodded. "Laura is a very wealthy young woman," he said, then went on to explain that at the time of Mrs. Pendleton's death, the Aborns were abroad. Upon their arrival in New York, Mrs. Aborn had received word of her mother's illness. It was then that Laura had been asked to postpone coming to Melrose Lake until his wife's return. Laura was staying on at her boarding school with the headmistress until our trip to Melrose. "She never received your letter," Nancy told him. "The Dowds must have intercepted it. Soon they told her to come." Just then, Nancy thought she had found the trick to freeing her hands, but a moment later she sighed in discouragement. The rope still bound her wrists. "At least we have a light," she said. Fortunately, Stumpy Dowd had forgotten the lantern. "Yes, but the oil is burning low," Mr. Aborn remarked quietly. "When it's gone, we'll be in the dark, as I have been for the past 2 weeks. Nancy shuddered. "Did Stumpy bring you food in little packages?" "Yes, when he thought of it. He kept me alive just to pump me for information, and threatened to harm Laura if I didn't tell him what he wanted to know." Suddenly, Nancy felt the rope which chafed her wrists slacken. At the same time, the light went out. The cellar was plunged into darkness. I basically thrive in the dark. Okay, honey. Love you. Good night. Yes, safe travels tomorrow. Sleep well. All my plans are foolish, is what I heard. Welcome back, Stalin. Stumpy Dad? Stumpy Dad. That's his name. In the dark. Okay, chapter 15. Plans for rescue. Back in River Heights, meanwhile, Hannah Gruen had spent a restless and worried evening expecting to hear Nancy's convertible pull into the driveway at any moment. Moreover, Mr. Drew had failed the call at the appointed hour, and Hannah had no knowledge of how to contact the lawyer. At 10:30, when the front doorbell rang, the housekeeper limped hurriedly to answer it. Instantly, she felt a sense of keen disappointment. "Oh, hello, Laura," she said, and turned to greet Dawn Cameron. "Did you have a good time at the barbecue?" "It was wonderful," Laura exclaimed happily as she and Dawn entered the house. "Certainly was fun," Dawn agreed. Too bad Nancy wasn't with us. Where is she, Mrs. Gruen? At these words, tears welled up in Hannah's eyes. She told of not hearing from either Nancy or Mr. Drew that evening. I'm so upset, she said. What will we do? Call the police? Probably Nancy decided to stay overnight at the Beach Cliff Hotel, Laura said at once. Have you called there to find out? No, because Nancy always calls when she changes her plans. Dawn, greatly concerned, went at once to the telephone. Does this guy even know Nancy? Impatiently, the young man waited for a response to his ring. The hotel telephone operator answered. When Dawn asked for Nancy Drew, the girl said, Just a moment. It was nearly 5 minutes before she told him, We're unable to reach your party. Miss Drew is not in the hotel. Okay, this is like overkill. Sorry, I'm like unhappy with the music right now. Then she didn't check out earlier this evening? Dawn inquired. No, Miss Drew is still registered. Don Cameron hung up, a drawn expression on his face. He told the others what he had learned. Oh, I just know something has happened to Nancy, Laura cried, her lower lip quivering with nervousness. And it's all my fault. Hannah took the girl into her arms. You must not feel this way, she said gently. Nancy is trying to help you because she wants to. Dawn spoke up. I don't know whether we should notify the police or drive to Melrose Lake ourselves. As the three hesitated, they heard an automobile stop in front of the house. Then a door slammed. Dawn looked out the window. It's a man, he said. He's coming to the door. Dawn opened the door to Carson Drew, who came inside immediately. He greeted Hannah and Dawn. Then, after being introduced to Laura Pendleton and bidding her welcome to his home, the lawyer asked, Where's Nancy? Upstairs? When told that his daughter had not returned from her investigation at Melrose Lake, the lawyer was gravely concerned. I don't like the sound of this at all, he said. I had no idea that Nancy was planning to sleuth in Mr. Aborn's home at night. She mentioned something about wanting to pay another visit to a mysterious shack in the woods, Mr. Drew, Hannah volunteered. But I don't know where it's located. Carson Drew's anxiety deepened. It would be just like Nancy to follow up a good clue, he said, particularly if she thinks there is something odd about the shack. She never gives up until she figures out the solution to whatever the problem is. Despite his worry, Nancy's father uttered these words proudly. He had often admired the initiative his daughter displayed when she was trying to unravel a mystery. I think you're on the right track, Mr. Drew, Don Cameron said thoughtfully. Since Nancy hasn't returned to the hotel, there are 3 possibilities. She's had car trouble, something has happened to her in the woods, or the Aborns have discovered Nancy prowling about their house, Laura put in fearfully. And if that's the case, there's no telling what they may do to her. The girl quickly mentioned a few of the things which had happened to her in her brief stay at the Aborns. I'll leave for Melrose Lake immediately, Mr. Drew announced. If I don't find Nancy in a very short time, I'm going to notify the police that she's missing. The others begged Mr. Drew to let them accompany him. The lawyer thought it best for Hannah to remain at home in case Nancy should call. But I'll be glad to have you accompany me, Laura and Dawn, he added. Dawn hurried to the telephone to notify his parents of the plan, while Laura went for a coat. Then they went outside and got into Mr. Drew's car. Be sure to call me as soon as you found out something, Hannah called. Don't worry, we will. Nancy's father was a skillful driver, and right now he was intent upon reaching the lake as soon as possible. He could barely restrain himself from breaking the speed limits. This is one time I wish I had a helicopter, he told the 2 young people. It wouldn't do you much good at Melrose Lake, Mr. Drew, said Laura. It's a pretty thickly wooded area. I doubt that you'd find a landing strip. Dawn realized that this remark, although unintentional, heightened Carson Drew's worry about Nancy being lost in the woods. He changed the subject quickly. I thought you weren't due home until Sunday, sir, Dawn said. That's right, the lawyer replied, his eyes intent on the highway ahead. Oh, the music's not even working now. Let's try this. In Cincinnati late this afternoon, I had a call from Chief McGinnis of the River Heights Police. He thought it was imperative for me to return home immediately. Mr. Drew proceeded to tell Dawn and Laura the complete story of the embezzlement case. Laura looked worried. "The Monroe National Bank had my mother's securities," she exclaimed. "You don't suppose—" "Maybe," Dawn put in. "Nancy learned something in connection with this at the Aborn house and is staying to get more information." "Oh, she shouldn't have done it," Laura cried out fearfully. "Now, there may not be anything to your theory," Mr. Drew remarked. "Don't borrow trouble." Dawn patted Lawyer's shoulder. "Sure, we have enough worries as it is. Mr. Drew, you were telling us why you came back early." "Yes. Although I'm making a private investigation for Mr. Seward, the bank president, Chief McGinnis has been helping me on an unofficial basis. We're old friends, you see. When Nancy told me that 2 of the suspects, the Dowds, were in the acting profession and had been out of town recently, I had a hunch they might tie in with the case. I asked the chief to check on any past records the couple might have and call me in Cincinnati." At this point, Carson Drew explained that Chief McGinnis had learned that the Dowds both had records for theft and embezzlement. Each had served prison terms. Using various aliases, they had either acted or worked in theaters in several states and, among other crimes, had robbed the ticket offices. "When the chief told me this," said Carson Drew, "I asked him to take the list of missing securities to various brokerage offices in the River Heights area. He did this and found that during the past few days, all of them had been sold by a woman." "The same woman?" Dawn asked. "Apparently not," Mr. Drew replied. "At least when Chief McGinnis asked for the woman's description, it was different every time." "How odd!" Laura exclaimed. "Could it have been Mrs. Dowd? Since she's an actress, she must be good at disguise." "You may be right," Mr. Drew acknowledged. "Anyway, the chief sent 2 officers to their house to pick up the Dowds for questioning." "Did they find them?" Dawn asked eagerly. The lawyer shook his head. "When the police got to the house, they learned that the actor and actress had had a man caller earlier in the day, and that the 3 had left together. Mr. Dowd said they would not be back." "How discouraging for you," Laura sighed in sympathy. "But I'm sure you'll find them." "There's a state alarm out for the couple," Mr. Drew said. "They shouldn't be able to get very far." "What do the Dowds look like?" Laura asked. In reply, you can't see my reaction because Max is dancing over my face. But my face was like, for a long time. "Thank you for the host, Jane." Oh, it was an auto host. 9 viewers? What the heck? Well, hello 9 viewers. Thanks for coming in. Okay, back to the story. In reply, the lawyer took 2 photographs from his breast pocket and handed them to her. Laura held the pictures toward the light on the dashboard. She shook her head in disbelief. "These are the Dowds?" she repeated. "Yes, why? Have you seen them before?" Laura said in a tense voice, "I know them as Mr. and Mrs. Aborn." "Oh, Mr. Drew, if they've caught Nancy, she's in real danger." Last playing Warframe. Okay, that was the end of the chapter. Let me catch up here. I don't know why my eyes are like blurry. Such a stumpy dad. I shouldn't be tired. I'm good at being in the dark. Chapter 15 hype. The terror lurks in the darkness. This guy, am I right? Oh, you can't even hear the music. Okay. How about that? Is that any better? Helicopter. Carson Drew's me deepened? What? Get to the chopper. Wow, me. Way to go, chapter 15. You done. Anxiety deepened. Oh! Yeah, I gotcha. Thank you for the clapping. Welcome for clapping. Okay, this song is kind of annoying. This website is a little hit or miss for me. But the other music was just like too happy. Why did I laugh so hard when Paige said get to the chopper? You can hear it now. Okay. It's not too loud, is it? I don't know, Salad. Why did you laugh? Okay, this is too happy. Not too loud. Okay, that's good. It was flawless. Get to the chopper. Is that why you're laughing? Because it's flawless? I don't know. We may be able to finish this book. I don't know. Let's just see how it goes. Okay. Chapter 16? Yes, 16. It's in Roman numerals, so I have to think about it for a second. For a second, I thought Gary Jules' Mad World was playing. Nope. This song is really depressing. I was obsessed with it for a while in middle school. This song is like way too feel good. Oh well. We'll just go with it. Okay, now is it too loud? It looks a little loud. I don't want it to be too loud. I like it. Yeah, I like it too. It just doesn't fit the story. I'll even give it a thumbs up. I like it, but I don't like the mix. But I'm sure that's part of the... It's at a fine volume, I think. Okay. Alright. Chapter 16, A Speedy Getaway. Unaware that help was coming, Nancy worked feverishly to slip her hands out of the ropes in the dark cellar of the shack. "How are you doing?" Jacob Aborn asked her. "The bonds are becoming looser," Nancy replied. Suddenly she recalled Hannah's promise to send the police to the Aborns' home if she had not returned at a reasonable hour. When she told the imprisoned man about this, it seemed to give him courage. However, to herself, Nancy said, by that time those criminals will have escaped. They may even prevent Hannah from carrying out her plan, and both Laura and Hannah may be harmed. As if to offset this alarming possibility, the ropes around Nancy's hands suddenly pulled free. "I did it!" she exclaimed, and Mr. Aborn sprang from his bench, crying, "We'll be able to escape!" Nancy did not respond, for she was working grimly at the ropes which bound her feet. "If I could only see," she muttered. Then she remembered the packet of matches in her skirt pocket. I thought it was a dress pocket before, and now it's a skirt pocket. She took it out and lighted a match, which she stuck in a crack in the wall. As the light burned, she worked to untie the knots that bound her ankles. Several more matches were used before she was free. "Miss Drew, you're the most ingenious girl I've ever met," Mr. Aborn said admiringly. "I wish I could think that fast. It just occurred to me that there's a can of kerosene under the stairs. You might fill the lantern." Nancy found the can, and in a few seconds the place was aglow with light. "Now I'll open the padlock again," Nancy told Mr. Aborn. After getting the key, she hurried to the side of Laura's guardian. A minute later, the chains fell to the floor with a loud thud. "At last!" Jacob Aborn cried in relief. "Our next step," said Nancy, "is to get out of here as fast as we can and then try to alert the police." "It's my bet," her companion said, that Dowd has already skipped town." Nancy was inclined to agree, but since the swindler had not expected his two prisoners to escape, he might still be at the Aborn house with his wife. "We'll head for my car," Nancy said, "and decide what we'll do when we reach it." Jacob Aborn moved forward several steps, then his knees began to tremble. "My legs will be all right after I've used them for a few minutes," he apologized. But try as he would, the man was unable to climb the stairway unassisted. Nancy reached out a strong arm to help him. At last, they reached the top of the stairway. The young sleuth led the way to the door, unbolted it, and the two stepped outside. "What a relief!" Jacob Aborn gasped, filling his lungs with pure air. In the east, the moon had risen over the woods, and the sky was peppered with stars. The route among the trees would be easy to find in the clear night. Yet Nancy glanced uneasily at her companion, wondering if he would be able to walk to the car. As if reading her thoughts, Aborn said, "I'm fine now, let's go." Nancy offered her arm again, and at a slow pace they walked across the clearing and entered the woods. They had gone but a short way when Mr. Aborn sank down on a log, breathing heavily. "You go on without me, Nancy," he said in a voice shaky with fatigue. "I can't do it." "Just rest here for a moment," Nancy said encouragingly, unwilling to leave the man. Shortly, Mr. Aborn felt he could continue. Leaning heavily on Nancy, he moved forward, refusing to pause again, even for a brief rest. "You're a very kind girl to help me," he said hoarsely. Nancy replied modestly, "I'm so glad I found you. Think of what it means to Laura to have her real guardian found. I know she will be happy living with you and your wife." At the mention of his wife's name, Mr. Aborn said he was grateful that she had gone away before the Dads invaded their home. "She might have been made a prisoner too," he declared. Presently, with a feeling of relief, Nancy caught sight of her convertible standing among the bushes where she had left it. After she had helped Mr. Aborn into the front seat, Nancy took her place behind the steering wheel. "Now we'll drive to the nearest police station," she announced. "You direct me." She inserted the key and tried the starter. To Nancy's surprise, the motor did not turn over. "That's funny," she said, and tried again. Nothing happened. Next, Nancy glanced at the fuel gauge. It registered half full. "I wonder if your battery's dead," Mr. Aborn said in a faint voice. "I think not," Nancy replied, as she reached into the glove compartment and took out an extra flashlight she kept there for emergencies. She got out of the car, lifted the hood, and flashed her light inside. She had taken a course in automobile mechanics and knew the possible sources of trouble. "I see what the trouble is," Nancy called. "The distributor has been uncapped, and the rotor's missing. This is sabotage. Without this necessary part, the car could not start. I'm sure that Mr. Dowd is the saboteur," she added angrily. Mr. Aborn sighed resignedly. "Stumpy Dowd leaves no stones unturned," he said in a tired voice. "Just in case we might escape, he wanted to make certain we'd have no transportation. I'm afraid, Nancy, that we'll have to go to the main highway for help." As Mr. Aborn spoke, Nancy heard a car motor not far away. Eagerly, she looked to right and left, but saw no approaching headlights. "Quick, duck down," Mr. Aborn whispered, and Nancy crouched in the bushes alongside her car. A dark foreign sports car emerged from the Eagle Rock Lane, then made a left-hand turn in the direction of Twin Lakes. "It's the Dowds making a getaway," Mr. Aborn said. "We're too late." Nancy was alarmed by this turn of events. She wondered why Stumpy Dowd was not heading toward River Heights. Had he given up the idea of going to the Drews' residence and forcing Laura Pendleton to give him the jewels, or was he taking an alternative route there? "Oh dear, I wish there were a telephone nearby," Nancy moaned. She told Mr. Aborn that his had been disconnected. Jacob Aborn spoke up. "Nancy, I'm sure that Dowd and his wife have left my house for good. I think the best plan is for us to go there." "Yes," Nancy agreed. "After you're safely inside, I'll go for help." "I can't let you do that," Jacob Aborn protested. "Few cars come along this road at night. You'll have an extremely long walk before you reach the main highway." Silently, Nancy agreed, but she also noted that the man's strength was almost spent. She helped him from the car, and the two slowly approached the lane that led to Mr. Aborn's house. "Oh, if I could only get my hands on that scoundrel," the man muttered. The thought gave him new strength, and he moved forward again. Cautiously, the two crept toward the house, approaching it from the rear. "We'd better make certain that no one's here," Nancy whispered. As they drew near the back door, she saw that it stood ajar, as though someone had left hurriedly without taking time to shut it. With Jacob Aborn close behind her, Nancy stepped cautiously into the kitchen. There was profound silence. The place appeared deserted. Crossing the room on tiptoe, Nancy and Mr. Aborn walked toward the living room. He clicked on a light. Everything was in disorder. A chair had been overturned, and papers were scattered about. "The Dads certainly made a thorough search," Nancy remarked. Just then, Mr. Aborn's eyes fell upon the wall safe, which stood open. With a cry of alarm, he tottered across the room to look inside. Everything had been taken out. Mr. Aborn groaned. He told Nancy that a sizable sum of his own money had been in the safe, along with shares of a negotiable stock. Stumpy Dad had forced him to tell the safe's combination on threat of harming Laura. Mr. Aborn, white as starch, sank into a nearby chair and buried his head in his hands. Nearly all my securities were in there, he said. One quick glance at him told Nancy that the man was on the verge of a complete collapse. She could not leave him alone, yet how could she get help without doing so? A second later, she and Mr. Aborn were startled to hear a car driving up the lane. Were the dads returning? Had the couple merely gone out for a while, or had they forgotten something in their hasty flight? Nancy's next thought was far worse than either of these. Had Stumpy Dad somehow learned that his two prisoners had escaped? End of chapter. Hey E, welcome for joining. Pepper stars. Pepper was stars, but not salted. Waits for Riddy to flip star tables for lack of salt stars. We'll just cry for salt stars. Thank you for the bits, Riddy. Thank you for cheering for the chapter. Stumpy Dad to the rescue. Stumpy Dad with all the amazing powers of stumps. Who bopped me? Bopped you? I can't see who bopped me because I'm in the bitboard. Oh, thank you for the follow, Durdla. There's an otter in my water. Bopped me in the bitboard. What do you mean? You're at 496 on the bitboard, E. Riddy's at 503. Tongue twisters. Yeah. It's terror, obviously. I wanted to watch them fall into the cup. Me too. Top cheer. The weekly bit leaderboard. Yeah, is what you meant. Okay, this song is like way too calm. I just can't find the right music for Nancy Drew books, you know? Oh, you can't even hear it. It's so quiet. See? This song is 10 minutes long. Too bad I have no more bits for now. I'm gonna change the song. That seems a little much. I've never been able to get bits by watching ads. I should try again, but I've never been able to do it. It's sad. I don't know why, really. I need that. I don't know why that's there, but okay. Next chapter is 27. Two-way detecting. That's the name of the chapter. Two-way detecting. Okay. As the automobile pulled to a halt, Mr. Aborn slumped to the floor in a faint. Evidently, he had shared Nancy's thought that the dads were returning and would force their way in. The terrifying thought that he might become a prisoner again had been too much for the exhausted man. Oh, Nancy cried out. Did I say 27? It's 17. We're on 17. Anyways. From the window, Nancy saw 4 people hurriedly alighting from the car. A moment later, the bell rang and a woman's voice cried, Mr. Aborn, please let us in. It's the Donnells. Nancy hurried to the front door and flung it open. Kathy, Jim, she cried out. Oh, you don't know how glad I am to see you. The 2 young people introduced Nancy to their parents, a good-looking couple in their 40s. Then they stepped inside. What are you doing here, Nancy? Jim Donnell asked, puzzled at the girl's disheveled appearance. What's going on? Nancy replied by saying Mr. Aborn was ill, and there was no time for further explanation right now. She hastily led the family into the living room. When they saw their unconscious friend on the floor, Mrs. Donald rushed forward with an excited cry. "How dreadful!" she exclaimed. As she knelt down, the kindly woman said she was a registered nurse. How convenient. After a brief examination of the patient, she reported that Mr. Aborn appeared to be suffering from malnutrition and shock. While Jim and his father lifted him onto the couch, Nancy told what had happened to him. The Donalds were stunned. Before they could discuss it, however, Nancy turned to Jim. 2 phone calls must be made right away, she said. Would you be able to take care of them for me? Glad to, the boy said. I suppose you want me to notify the police to pick up Stumpy Dad. Yes, Nancy said tersely, and described the black foreign car. Yeah, you can, send it to Riddy. Yes, Nancy's, wait. Yeah, she next asked Jim to call Chief McGinnis at River Heights and tell him to have extra men patrol the Drew home. Find out if Mrs. Gruen and Laura are all right, she requested, and see if our housekeeper knows where to get in touch with Dad. Jim said he would do all of these things. As soon as he returned, he would try to fix Nancy's car. After Jim left, Nancy turned to the others. Mr. Aborn had regained consciousness and said he felt better and able to talk. Lillian, he said, giving Mrs. Donald a wan smile. The angels must have sent you. How did you know we were in trouble here? We didn't, for sure, Mr. Donald replied gravely. Until tonight. It's a long story. The gray-haired man said that he and his wife had been amazed to hear on Tuesday from their children that Mary and Aborn had returned from Florida and that she and Jacob had met Laura Pendleton at Twin Lakes. We were sure you would have told us of your change of plans if this were true, Jacob, he said to his old friend. Anyway, we came over here yesterday morning to say hello and meet Laura. No one answered the bell. We concluded, said Mrs. Donald, that Nancy Drew had been mistaken in thinking that you were coming back here. Anyway, we remembered you saying that due to the illness of Marion's mother, you would not be able to come here with Laura until after your wife's return. That's right, said Mr. Aborn. He explained to Nancy that first there had been legal technicalities regarding his appointment as the orphan's guardian, since he had been living in another state. That was why his ward had remained at her boarding school. Mrs. Donald went on to say that this evening they had received a telephone call from Mrs. Aborn, who was still in Florida. Marion had tried several times to get you and was upset to learn that the phone here was disconnected. She called us to see why. My wife hadn't heard from me in over 2 weeks, Mr. Aborn stated. Mrs. Donald said, but Marion thought she had. Mrs. Aborn sent telegrams here, and replies came to her in Florida. Mr. Donald said that when the family heard that Marion Aborn was indeed in Florida, they were fearful something was terribly wrong. We told Marion what we knew, suggested she come home immediately, and said we would come over here right away to see what we could uncover. Thank goodness you did, Nancy sighed, and Mr. Aborn gave his friends a grateful smile. Then he asked, how is Marion's mother? Getting along very well. When will my wife arrive? Mr. Aborn asked anxiously. She's taking a night plane from Miami to the Hamilton airport, Mrs. Donald replied. My husband will meet her. Kathy's mother then went to the kitchen to prepare a light meal for Mr. Aborn. Nancy excused herself and went to wash her face, legs, and grimy hands. Refreshed, she returned to the living room, wondering what was keeping Jim so long. He'll be here soon, Nancy, said Kathy. I'll feel much better when I know everything's all right at home, Nancy replied. While Mr. Aborn ate, the pretty detective told the others of Stumpy Dad's connection with Mr. Drew's case. What a story, Mr. Donald exclaimed. Nancy excused herself for a moment and went to the front door to listen for Jim's car. As she stood on the steps, her heart suddenly leaped. A tall figure stood up from behind a bush near the front steps. Nancy? A man's voice called softly. Nancy knew who it was. Dad! She cried out. Carson Drew leaped the steps and gave his daughter a resounding kiss. Are you all right? He whispered. When Nancy said yes, and that it was safe to talk aloud, Don Cameron and Laura emerged from some shrubbery. We saw lights and heard voices, Laura explained. We thought it was the Aborns. What's going on here, Nancy? Yes, tell us, Don urged. Once again, Nancy explained what had happened. Carson Drew listened to his daughter's story of her encounter with the thief, a stern expression on his face. You were lucky to come out of this so well, he remarked. Yes, Laura agreed. And it's so wonderful. And it's so wonderful to have a guardian whom you say is nice. Mr. Aborn is a fine person, Laura, Nancy said. I'll take you in to meet him in a minute. Carson Drew now brought Nancy up to date on his news, and ended by saying, We were so worried we drove here immediately, not even taking time to call the police. Dawn added that they had left Mr. Drew's car at the end of the lane and were scouting the house to see if Nancy were inside when she had appeared on the front steps. How many times I wished you were here, said Nancy. She now suggested that everyone come into the house to meet the others. Jim Donnell, she added, should return any minute. I'll wait for the young man out here and act as guard in case the Dowds show up, Carson Drew said, sitting down on a step. The rest of you run along. As Nancy walked inside with Dawn and Laura, she saw that Mr. and Mrs. Donnell were helping Mr. Aborn up the stairs to his bedroom. Hearing voices, the guardian turned, looked at his ward, and exclaimed, Laura, dear, at last! I'd know you anywhere. You look just like your mother. Mr. Aborn, Laura cried out. She raced up the steps and gave her guardian a big kiss. And she's never met him in her life? Introductions were quickly made, and when Mr. Aborn was settled in his bed, he had a visit with Laura and Nancy. But after they had chatted for a few minutes, the girls could see that the man needed sleep badly. We'll say good night now, said Nancy. Sweet dreams. She turned off the light, and they went downstairs. When Nancy and Laura reached the first floor, they found Mr. Drew and Jim Donnell talking in the hall with a state trooper. While Kathy took Laura aside, Nancy walked toward the group. She was introduced to Sergeant Murphy. Then Carson Drew explained to her that the state police were putting all available cars on the chase and hoped to round up the Dowds and their accomplice shortly. Good, Nancy exclaimed. But what about Mrs. Groon? Sergeant Murphy said that he had talked with Chief McGinnis. The River Heights official had immediately sent a patrol car and 4 men to the Drews' home. This is weird. Your housekeeper was relieved to hear that you, Miss Drew, had been found, he reported. Nothing unusual has happened at your home tonight, but it will be closely guarded until the Dowds and their accomplice are caught. Oh, I'm glad, said Nancy. Sergeant Murphy left after saying he would check back later. Nancy and Mr. Drew walked into the living room, and she introduced her father to Mr. and Mrs. Donnell and Kathy. After a few minutes of excited conversation, the young sleuth said, Dad, I have a hunch that the man Fred, whom Stumpy Dowd mentioned, is someone employed at the Monroe National Bank. Tell me, was Mrs. Pendleton's name ever mentioned in connection with the missing securities? Mr. Drew shook his head. No, Nancy, it wasn't. Then, said Nancy, I think we're going to find that Laura's bonds were never deposited in the bank's vault. Whoever took them and passed them on to Stumpy Dowd must be someone who works in the custodian department of the bank. That's good reasoning, Nancy, her father agreed. But we have checked almost all the employees, and they've been given a clean bill of health. One man, Mr. Hamilton's assistant, has been on vacation, and we won't be able to interview him for another week or so. What's the man's name? Nancy asked. Mr. Drew consulted a list of names, which he took from his pocket. William Friednick. Nancy snapped her fingers. Friednick? Maybe he's the Fred that the Dowds were talking about. Oh, Frednick. Sorry, Frednick. And if he is, she continued excitedly, I think they're together, and I believe I know where the Dowds are hiding out with this man. Carson Drew looked at his daughter in amazement. Where? He asked. Not far from here, Nancy said mysteriously. Then she jumped up from her chair. Let's find out, Dad. End of chapter. I'm getting hungry. Why am I getting hungry? Salad is pursuing a life of chat crime now. No, I swear it's not like that. What's the song? Nancy Drew music. Secret of the Old Clock. Yeah, I could totally be listening to Nancy Drew music right now. That's smart, isn't it? Class trial time. Now Salad is using non-Twitch emotes in the Twitch chat. Sometimes a smirk is needed. It's true. Sometimes a riddy is needed. I cannot get over his being called Stumpy Dad. But it's Stumpy Dowd. You know that, right? Or do I just sound like I have a speech impediment? Nancy, we're inside. The guy who just needs sleep. Did it really sound like I'm saying dad? I'm just gonna play Secret of the Old Clock music. There we go. First playlist. I feel like it's fitting. Okay. You thought so? I'm worried that that means that I have a speech impediment. That I'm saying dad instead of dowd. Am I not enunciating enough? Do I need to work on my enunciation? Do I need to take acting classes? I don't know what that was. Please forgive me. We're getting really close to the end here. This might be the last chapter. No, we have... I think we have 3 chapters, but they're pretty short. Okay. Hello, Teddy. Is that code? I have no idea, but whatever. Hello. Welcome to the stream. I think the problem is in my brain. No, I think the problem is in the way I say Dowd. I don't know. I don't know, guys. Just roll with it. Okay, we are on chapter 28. Why do I keep saying 20? I'm sorry. 18. The title is Night Trail. Yeah. We're just gonna go for it. Okay. Carson Drew, startled, looked at his daughter. Chapter 38 hype. Where do you think the Dowds and Fred are hiding, Nancy? In a bungalow on Twin Lakes, the one I told you we stayed in after Laura rescued us, she explained. My main reasons for thinking so are these. I saw a black foreign car come from there, and the place was well stocked with food. Fred may have been living there. Go on, this is interesting, the lawyer said. Nancy's hunch was that the thieves had first planned the bank theft, then the Dowds had rented the bungalow under an assumed name. Makes sense, Carson Drew nodded. Fred, Nancy continued, knew of Laura's large estate and jewelry, and got the idea of having Stumpy Dowd impersonate Mr. Aborn. In order to get the jewelry, they had to have Laura with them, so they decided to take her to the Melrose Lake house. Good logic, said Mr. Drew. Then, when the real Mr. Aborn appeared, they had to kidnap him temporarily. Well, we'll follow your hunch. The song. Shall we go? Sorry, I think I have something in my eye. Okay. The others offered to go, but Mr. Drew thought that the Donnells should stay with Mr. Aborn and Laura. Please do, Nancy added. After all, my hunch could be wrong. The dads may return here. We'll nab 'em if they do, Jim said determinedly. A few minutes later, Mr. Drew's car was on the detour again, heading for the Twin Lakes Road. When they reached it, there were no other cars in evidence. That's odd, said Nancy, knowing that this was the only road which connected the two resorts. Oh, said Dawn. Look. Mr. Drew had also seen a small red light a few hundred feet distant. He slowed up. Ahead was a gate obstruction across the highway. On it was nailed the sign which read, Road under construction, travel at your own risk. This is great, Mr. Drew remarked unhappily. Maybe it won't be too bad, Nancy said. I came this way the other day, and I think I know all the turns. Why don't we try it, sir? Dawn spoke up. All right. Dawn got out of the car and moved the barrier enough so Mr. Drew could drive through. They went slowly because of the steam shovels, bulldozers, and equipment parked along the road. To make matters worse, the pavement was gone in places where repairs were being made. The car tires swallowed in soft dirt. Soon, however, they reached the end of the construction section, and Carson Drew stepped on the accelerator. The car responded with a burst of speed. We're not far from Twin Lakes now, Nancy said, as she spotted a few familiar landmarks. Dawn wanted to know what the plan would be when they reached the bungalow. Mr. Drew said they would first check to see if the foreign car were in the vicinity. It's interesting grammar rules that they're using here. Of course it will be hidden. Next, Nancy added, we'll have to make sure Fred and the dads are there, and not some innocent people. But if Stumpy's there, we'll notify the police. Right, Dad? Unless Dad sees us first, he said grimly. Nancy said she hoped this would not happen. But I suppose they probably will have someone acting as a lookout. As I understand it, Nancy, said her father, the bungalow is in an isolated spot. Yes, and there are a lot of trees around it. Could anyone inside the house make a getaway by boat? Dawn asked. Not easily, Nancy answered. The bungalow is not built over the water. It's some distance from the lake, and there's no dock where a boat could be tied. Presently, she said, we're about a mile from the bungalow. Carson Drew's face tensed. He drove to a point about a tenth of a mile from the lane leading down to the bungalow, then stopped the car in a clearing off the road. We'll cover the rest of the distance on foot, he announced. As Nancy got out, the right-hand side of the car after dawn, she glanced at the luminous dial on the clock. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. Walking 3 abreast, the sleuth saw the bungalow below. It was in darkness. I don't see any sign of a car, Dawn whispered to Nancy as he guided her by the arm. Yeah, 'cause Nancy can't walk by herself. Carson Drew was silent, but suddenly he jerked to attention. A twig had snapped. Now they saw a man walking toward the trio through the woods. As Dawn, Nancy, and Mr. Drew ducked behind some shrubbery, they noticed that the man approaching them was carrying a fishing pole and a box of the type ordinarily used for bait. Passing by the watchers, he walked unhurriedly toward the beach. At this moment, the moon chose to show itself brilliantly, and Nancy observed that the man was tall and heavy. Hello, Sam, he said, and now the watchers could see a rowboat and passenger gliding out of the shadows. I hope the fish are biting well this morning, his voice carried clearly in the stillness. The fisherman deposited his gear in the boat, and the two companions shoved off. They were barely out of sight when Dawn whispered hoarsely, a light in the bungalow. From the second-story window had come a flash of light. It did not reappear. Someone's up there, Nancy whispered. Maybe the fisherman alerted him. Let's circle the house, said Carson Drew, and suggested that he take the left half of the circle, while Nancy and Dawn took the right. They would meet back at this same spot in a few minutes. Be careful now, he warned the young people. You too, Dad, Nancy said. The route Nancy and Dawn took led past the door into the first floor of the boathouse bungalow. Cautiously, they listened at the exit. There was no sound from within. They went on to the beach side. The two tiptoed among the shadows as far as the center of the rear of the building without incident, then quietly returned to the meeting place. When they arrived, Mr. Drew was not there. That's funny, said Nancy, a little alarmed. Where is Dad? Just then, she and Dawn heard a low groan. It seemed to come from behind a tree about 20 feet away. Forgetting caution, the couple rushed to the spot. Behind its broad trunk, a man lay sprawled on the ground. Mr. Drew. "Dad!" Nancy exclaimed, kneeling down. She felt the lawyer's pulse. It was steady. "I think he was knocked out," said Dawn angrily. "Nancy, you're right about this being a hideout. We must get the police." "And right away," Nancy agreed, as Carson Drew sat up groggily. In a moment, he could talk. The lawyer said that after leaving Nancy and Dawn, he had started around the bungalow. Someone had come from behind and struck him. "I suppose he dragged me here." "Stumpy Dad, I'll bet," Nancy exclaimed. "And this may mean that he and his wife made a getaway while Dawn and I were on the other side of the bungalow. Dad, do you feel well enough to try to follow them?" "Yes, but where did they go?" he asked. "And how? By boat, car, or on foot?" As if in answer to his question, the three suddenly saw in the clear moonlight the figures of 2 men and a woman running up the bungalow lane toward the road. Each man carried a big suitcase, Laura's inheritance, and Mr. Aborn's little fortune. "After them," Dawn cried. But Mr. Drew could not make it. He tottered unsteadily and leaned against the pine. "Go on," he said. "No," Nancy replied quickly. "Dawn, bring Dad's car here, will you?" As the boys started off, the trio heard the muffled backfire of an automobile coming from the direction of the woods across the main road. "Hurry, Dawn," Nancy urged. They had a car hidden there. By the time Dawn returned, Carson Drew felt better. He suggested that Nancy drive since she was more familiar with the road. When everyone was in the car, with the lawyer in the rear seat, they took off. Upon reaching the road, the young sleuth turned right. "I think this is the direction the other car took," she said. "Anyway, it leads to Stamford, where I know there's a state police headquarters." And there's a picture. Carson Drew sat up groggily. The road became rough and was full of sharp turns. Nancy drove fast but carefully, slowing at each curve. There was no sign of another car until Dawn suddenly cried out, "I think we're approaching a car." Nancy peered forward intently. She saw nothing but the road ahead. "It's hidden now by that hill in front of us," Dawn told her. There was a long moment of suspense, then Nancy exclaimed, "I see it. Do you think it's the Dowds?" Dawn asked. "It could be," Mr. Drew replied. As the car reached a smooth, straight piece of road, Nancy put it to a faster and faster pace. "We're gaining on them," Dawn said exuberantly. Little by little, the Drew sedan crept up on the car ahead. This music. Soon its headlights spotlighted the rear of the other vehicle, a black foreign car. 3 figures were silhouetted inside it. At the same moment, Nancy caught sight of a huge black and white checkerboard sign at the side of the road. A bad curve ahead. With well-timed precision, Nancy eased up on her speed and gradually used her brake, knowing that abrupt pressure might cause a bad skid. "That other driver isn't paying any attention to the warning," Dawn exclaimed. The snake-like curve was only a few hundred feet ahead on a steep downgrade. The occupants of the Drew sedan held their breath. Would the others make the turn? There came a violent screech of brakes. "Oh no!" Nancy cried out in horror. As she and her companions watched, the foreign car shot off the edge of the road and plunged down a steep cliff. End of the chapter. This music fits a lot better. Chapter 208. Hope's Stumpy Dad Saves the Day. Is it a twinkle in your eye page? Pretty sure. Grammar. Ooh, chapter 218 was great. Let's watch the bits. Let's watch them go in the cup. Thank you, Rudy. You're so sweet. Wait, did the thing not update? The cheerleader board? I don't know. That's weird. Oh hey, I met 130 out of 150 for my follower goal. Pulling further away in the race for Riddy. Random but Emerald Enigma says hi. What? Okay. Okay, hello, Emerald Enigma. I say hi back. Okay, don't ask? Okay, I'll take your word for it. We're very close to finishing, so I'm gonna keep going. Chapter 19, K19, Missing Property. Stunned by the accident to the speeding car, Nancy brought the stand to a halt at the curve. Everyone inside was reluctant to look down into the ravine below, from which there was not a sound, but only for an instant. Then Carson Drew urged, "Out, everyone, quickly! We must do what we can for those people." Okay. Hi back and bye for tonight. Okay. Let's see. Nancy and Dawn sprang from the car and rushed to the edge of the road. The lawyer was close behind them. As the three gazed down into the ravine, the first light of dawn revealed that the foreign car had rolled nearly to the bottom of it and overturned against a boulder. A wheel had been torn loose from its axle, and the body had been smashed in. There was no sign of any of the three occupants. A silence held the trio above. It was inconceivable that anyone in the wreck could be alive. At last Carson Drew found his voice. "I guess we'd better notify the police and emergency squad," he said. Dawn agreed, but Nancy thought they should first see if by chance any of the accident victims were alive. Mr. Drew and Dawn nodded and followed Nancy as she scrambled down the incline. Nancy, in the lead, gasped as she saw the body of a strange man, apparently not the driver, which had been flung out of the car into a clump of bushes near the wreck. She also noticed gasoline spilling from a hole in the tank. Vaguely, she thought of fire and an explosion. "Hurry," she urged. As the three drew closer, they saw a man's leg and a woman's high-heeled shoe protruding from beneath the left-hand side of the car. With frantic haste, Dawn and Mr. Drew dragged the man out, while Nancy tugged at the woman's body. Stumpy Dowd and his wife. Both were breathing but unconscious. The victims, cut and badly bruised, were carried to a safe place on the grass. "Now let's see about the other man, Mr. Drew," urged Dawn. As they headed for the bushes where he lay, Nancy stared at the car. "The suitcases," she thought. "Laura's inheritance and Mr. Aborn's little fortune. I must get them out before they may be burned up." Crawling under the wreck, she began to grope about frantically. Her hand struck a suitcase and she dragged it out. At that instant, Nancy realized how hot the metal was. There might be spontaneous combustion at any second. She must work fast to save the second suitcase. "It's the only way I can ever repay Laura for saving my life on Twin Lakes," Nancy thought. By feeling around, she found the bag and triumphantly brought it out, only to be jerked from the scene by Carson Drew and Dawn. "Nancy!" Carson Drew cried, white-faced and horror-stricken. "Are you mad? Those suitcases aren't worth your life!" There was a sudden explosion. Oh wow, this is good music for this. Then flames enveloped the car, and the dry grass in the immediate vicinity began to burn. Don Cameron shuddered, but looked at Nancy, admiration showing in his eyes. "You're the most courageous girl I've ever met," he said slowly. "Nancy, you might have been killed." As she herself realized what a narrow escape she had had, Nancy breathed a prayer of thanksgiving. She was shaken and silent as the man threw dirt on the flames to keep them from spreading. When they finished, Don told Nancy that he and Mr. Drew thought the third man would be all right, although the stranger, as well as the Dowds, were injured, perhaps seriously. "Now I suppose we must get the three of them to the hospital as fast as we can," he said. At that moment, they all heard the low whine of an ambulance alarm. This was followed by a police siren. Nancy, Mr. Drew, and Dawn looked at one another hopefully. "Do you suppose—" Nancy began. She was right. Help had come. A moment later, police and emergency squad cars stopped at the top of the ravine. 4 officers, 2 stretcher bearers, and an intern clad in white hurried down to the group. "Thank goodness," said Mr. Drew. Introductions were quickly made, then he asked, "How did you know about the accident?" An officer, Lieutenant Gill, told him that a farmer living not far away had seen the speeding car go off the road and notified headquarters. When we heard it was a black foreign car, we were suspicious immediately, he said. Can you identify these people as the Dowds? From pictures, yes, said Mr. Drew, and briefly told the whole story of the Dowd affair up to the present moment. And I can testify that they were impersonating the Aborns, Nancy added. Anybody know who the other man is? Lieutenant Gill inquired. I believe, Mr. Drew replied, that he's William Frednick, assistant to the president of the River Heights branch of the Monroe National Bank. He's suspected of removing certain securities from the bank. During this conversation, the intern had been examining the accident victims, and the attendants had laid them on stretchers. The doctor reported that the victims had been given first aid and had revived. They would be in good shape after a short stay in the hospital. They'll get a nice long rest after that, said Lieutenant Gill, in the state pen. I shan't try to question them now. As the prisoners were carried up to the ambulance, with others following, Lieutenant Gill explained to the Dowds how Nancy had saved them from being burned in the wreckage. I don't believe it, said Stumpy, ungratefully. His wife was more gracious. Thanks, Miss Drew. And I want to tell you I'm tired of this whole business. You're only a kid, but you've really taught me a lesson. Nancy did not answer. She found herself choking up, and tears came into her eyes. As the ambulance moved away, Nancy, quickly brushing her moist eyes dry with the backs of her hands, turned toward the east. She observed that a beautiful sunrise was beginning to flood the sky with brilliant color. Don yawned. What do you say we head for home? He suggested. Otherwise, I'll never be able to make my sister's wedding this evening. Oh dear, Nancy exclaimed. I forgot all about it. Please forgive us for keeping you up all night. Don grinned. I wouldn't have missed this excitement for anything. I suggest, said Mr. Drew, that we go back to Nancy's hotel, and the Drews will get some sleep. Don, you take my car and return to River Heights. Later, Nancy and I will take a taxi and pick up her convertible at the Aborns. Thank you, sir. I'll do that. While the three had been talking, Lieutenant Gill had been wedging open one of the two locked suitcases, which Nancy had taken from the wrecked car. Mr. Drew and the others walked over as he lifted the lid. The bag was jammed with feminine clothing. There were several dresses, a large makeup kit, pieces of lingerie, shoes, and several wigs, a gray one, a black hairpiece, and one which was decidedly auburn. That clinches it, Dad, Nancy exclaimed. Mrs. Dowd must have gone around in disguise to cash the bonds. But where's the money she got? Dawn asked. It must be in the other bag, Nancy suggested, together with securities and money belonging to Laura Pendleton, Mr. Aborn, and River Heights bank clients. Lieutenant Gill opened the second suitcase. It contained men's clothing and toilet articles. Nancy, you risked your life for this, Dawn exclaimed. Nancy Drew could not believe her eyes. Had she been mistaken in believing that Stumpy Dowd had put the contents of Mr. Aborn's safe in the bags? Quickly, she glanced down at the foreign car. Had Laura's inheritance and other people's money burned in it? The thought stunned the young sleuth, but in a moment an idea came to her. There's just a possibility the papers are here, she said. All eyes turned on the girl detective as the group awaited a further explanation. I'm just going to keep going to the next chapter because it's short and it's the last one. Chapter 20. A Surprise Gift. I'm sure, said Nancy, that Mr. Dowd not only put the money and securities in one of these suitcases, but never removed them. Then where are they? Dawn asked. Nancy smiled. These bags may have false bottoms. Lieutenant Gill said, Why, of course. I should have thought of that. Kneeling down, he soon found that Nancy was right. The bottom of each bag opened up, and disclosing packages of $1,000 bills and securities. Good thinking, Nancy, said Dawn admiringly. You're a whiz of a detective, all right. It took Mr. Drew and the officers several minutes to count the large sum of money and make a rough estimate of the value of the stocks and bonds. When they finished, the officer gave Carson Drew a receipt to turn over to the president of the Monroe National Bank. Meanwhile, he would take the stolen property to police headquarters and send on a detailed report. A few minutes later, Nancy's group said goodbye to the officers and returned to Mr. Drew's car. When they reached the Beach Cliff Hotel, Nancy and Mr. Drew got out. They thanked Don for all he had done. Don't mention it, the young man grinned. Turning to Nancy, he added, I kept my date with you yesterday after all. As he got into the driver's seat, Don said that when he returned the car to the Drews' home, he would tell Hannah Gruen what happened. It was now very light. Nancy and her father, exhausted, could hardly wait to get a few hours' sleep. They tumbled into their beds and slept until noon, then met in the hotel dining room for a hearty brunch. "How's your head, Dad?" Nancy asked. "Sound as ever," Carson Drew said, grinning. "I don't even have a bump." "Then we have a date," Nancy told him, waving a note. "This was at the desk. I picked it up. The clerk said Jim Donnell left it a little while ago." "The date's with him?" Mr. Drew asked. "No, Laura Pendleton. She says she and the Aborns are thrilled by the news which the police relayed, and would like us to come to their house as soon as possible. What do you say, Dad?" "We'll go." As Nancy finished her pancakes and sausages, she remarked that she could hardly wait to start for the Aborns' home. "I wonder if the Dads have confessed everything, and what Mr. Frednick had to say." "In my opinion, it's an open and shut case," the lawyer replied. While Mr. Drew paid the hotel bill, Nancy called the taxi, and soon the Drews were heading for Eagle Rock Lane. Reaching it, they got out of the cab, and the lawyer paid the driver. Nancy slid in behind the steering wheel of her convertible, as Mr. Drew got in on the other side. The motor started at once. "Good old Jim," Nancy said with a smile, and drove up the lane to the Aborn home. As she parked, the front door was opened by a woman of about 45. Her pretty face showed humor, kindness, and intelligence. After the Drews had introduced themselves, the woman said she was Marian Aborn, and had reached home in the wee small hours because her plane was late. "I've been most eager to meet you two," she added, smiling. "How can I ever thank you for all you've done?" As the callers went inside, Laura Pendleton hurried down from the second floor. After greeting Mr. Drew, she gave Nancy a kiss and exclaimed, "Everything is so wonderful. You've captured the thieves and recovered all the money, and I have the nicest guardians anyone could ever hope for. And Jacob and I have a daughter to love," said Marian Aborn, smiling fondly at Laura. Nancy asked how Mr. Aborn felt. His wife said, "Come see for yourselves," and led the way to a small study at the rear of the house. She knocked, then opened the door, and Nancy heard the steady drum of typewriter keys. Jacob Aborn was seated behind the machine. The erstwhile cellar prisoner already looked like a new man. His face was flooded with color, and his eyes were alert and happy. Now he stood up, greeted the Drews, and expressed his great appreciation for all they had done in recovering his and Laura's property. He grinned at Nancy. "First time a girl ever risked her life for me," he said. "To show my appreciation, I'm writing my adventure. You know, writing is my business. If I sell this one to a magazine, I'm going to give the proceeds to Nancy's favorite charity, the River Heights Youth Center." "Why, that's terrific!" Nancy exclaimed. Mrs. Aborn's face sobered. She said that she had not yet heard the entire story of what had happened. Before anyone had a chance to tell her, the doorbell rang. Lieutenant Gill walked in with Chief McGinnis of River Heights and another man. While Nancy greeted the officers, her father hurried to shake hands with the stranger. "This is Mr. Seward, president of the Monroe National Bank," he announced a moment later, and introduced the dignified, white-haired man. The president's glance included the policeman, and as he said, "I want to thank all of you in person for the splendid job you did in capturing the Dowds and the 2 bank employees involved in the thefts." "There's a fourth man?" Nancy asked in amazement. Mr. Seward explained that Alma Dowd's brother, Joe Jackson, had been employed by the Monroe National Bank in their vault department for some time. He and Frednick had cooked up the scheme of taking the securities. They had done this between audits of the bank's holdings. Frednick, in his job as assistant custodian, had known exactly how to place his hands on the valuable stocks and bonds. Frednick overheard Mrs. Pendleton's discussion with me about Laura and the large estate she would inherit someday, Mr. Seward said, and also that Mr. Aborn would be your guardian. When Frednick learned that Laura Pendleton had a valuable jewelry collection, he instantly thought of a swindle scheme. Frednick had chanced to meet Mr. Aborn one time while vacationing at Melrose Lake. He had been amazed by the strong resemblance between Aborn and Stumpy Dowd, whom Alma's brother had introduced to Frednick. He asked Dowd to impersonate Mr. Aborn and to move up the date when Laura would come to the guardian's home. He even deposited some securities with the bank in Stumpy's name, so there would be no question of Dowd's having anything to do with the thefts. "Where is Joe Jackson now?" Nancy asked. Chief McGinnis said he would answer this question. "We caught him cruising by the Drews' home. When we stopped the car, he tried to escape. After the whole story broke, we got a confession from him. He was going to burglarize your home, Nancy, to find the jewels." "There's one thing I don't understand," said Mrs. Aborn. Why did the Dowds rent the bungalow when they had helped themselves to this house? Nancy grinned. I'm sure I know, she said. Dad was smart enough not to want either Frednick or Jackson to stay here, just in case anyone from the bank traced the thefts to them before Dowd could make a getaway. So he had Alma Dowd rent the bungalow and convince Frednick that it was a good hideout. After Mr. Aborn and Laura had signed statements for the police, the officers and Mr. Seward left. Nancy suddenly felt a sense of loneliness and realized it was because her work on the case was at an end. Would another mystery come her way to solve? She wondered. And it did. In less than a week, Nancy was facing up to the challenge of the mystery at Lilac Inn. Nancy and her father now said goodbye to the family at Eagle Rock. As Nancy gave Laura a farewell hug, she asked, "When will you come to get your jewelry?" Laura consulted her guardian, who said the next day would be convenient for them to drive to River Heights. Will 3 o'clock be all right? Yes, indeed. The following afternoon, Laura Pendleton and the Aborns arrived promptly. After iced tea and some of Hannah's delicious open-faced sandwiches. Open-faced sandwiches? What does that mean? Laura whispered to Mr. Drew that she would love to get her jewelry from the safe. Excusing himself, Nancy's father left the room and returned in a few minutes with the package, which he handed to Laura. Nancy, meanwhile, was listening to Jacob Aborn's surprising news that he had finished his story and was sending it to a leading magazine. Wonderful, said Nancy. As she said this, she looked up to see Laura standing before her. In the girl's hand was the beautiful aquamarine ring Nancy had admired earlier in the week. I'd like you to wear this, Laura said shyly, as a reminder that our friendship began on the water. Quickly, she slipped the ring on the third finger of Nancy's right hand. The pretty detective gave an exclamation of delight and admired the gift for a long moment. Then she showed it to the others. At last, she turned to Laura and said with genuine sincerity, "The ring is priceless, and I'll always treasure it as a reminder of you, although no one can place a value on a true friendship like ours." Seeing tears in Laura's eyes, Nancy added quickly with a grin, "Even if we had to be shipwrecked to get an introduction." And that's the end of the mystery. We finished it! I didn't know if I was going to finish it tonight or not. Let's see. We'll explain later. Okay, it was my weird brother. He was looking over my shoulder and insisted, even though it made no sense. Okay. That's okay. I don't even know why the name. He isn't familiar with Twitch. Oh, okay. The wee small hours. Dad had nothing to do with the thefts. Some stumpy dad is so innocent. She can see the future. Open-faced sandwiches means not with the slice of bread on top, but to the side. Choose sandwiches from one-ish. Yeah, it's essentially a slice of bread with all the makings of sandwich on it without a top piece. So like toast. Oh, okay. Thank you for clapping for the book. Huzzah! I don't know why my eyes are so tired. Do I look awake? And I'm gonna have to get a snack before I start cleaning. Cleaning at 2 a.m. Oh, thank you for clapping, Salad. Thank you for suggesting the music because I think that helped. Why am I tired? Because I haven't been sleeping well this week. You appear to be awake. I'm gonna pause the music. Okay, guys. Well, I don't have my stream schedule up for next week yet, but my next stream should be on Monday at regular time, unless I have something going on, but I don't think I do. I never sleep well. Oh, Terry. I'm sorry. Why am I tired? It's 2 in the morning. Yeah, but Salad, you have to realize I got out of bed like between 3 and 4 p.m. So, like, I haven't been awake that long. Shame you keep yourself up till 5 a.m. for some reason. For some reason. Oh. Why are you awake, Sally? Well, it is Friday night. The life. Okay, so anyways, if I don't see you before then, I will see you on Monday at 2 p.m. Not sure which game yet. I will figure that out. I will announce it in the Discord. Yeah. Did you guys have any thoughts on the book? Do you want to discuss the book? It just reminded me of Secret of the Old Clock. That's really... Darts out of the room. Why are you darting out of the room? It's true. It's Zach Morris's fault. Yep. It's true. I wouldn't know about staying up late. Ready. Yeah. I don't know what we should read next. I'll have to look and maybe take a poll or something. Have a fantastic night. Zach Morris is trash. Rudy never stays up late. Never ever. That's hilarious. You guys are so funny. Never, 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 never. Never say never. Ever. Just to complete the sentence. Ever. Wow. You guys are special. But this is why I love you. I think I look sleepy. Okay. I will leave it at that. Thank you all for being here at my late night reading stream. Hope it was okay. Glad we finished the book. I think it was alright. And I can see why they use some of it for Secret of the Old Clock. You look somewhat sleepy. Okay. She loves us 'cause we're special. Don't talk so softly. I'm gonna fall asleep. That's okay. It's time to fall asleep, right? Okay. Have fun cleaning. Yeah, so fun. I need to take the Christmas tree down. I will get it done. Cleaning luck. Thank you. Okay. I'll see you guys later. Bye.